Welcome everyone to Pathways Through the Orchard. Tonight is the last Torah portion of the book of Bereshit, of Genesis, called Vayechi, and he lived. And it begins, Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim shva esrei shana, v'haya yemei Yaakov shnei chayav sheva shanim v'arba'im u'ma'at shana. Yaakov lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years, and the days of Yaakov's life were 7 years and 140 years, 147 when he passed away. So tonight, we'll see how much we get through, but I have a series of, I'll call it shorter insights instead of just one or two. I have here 5 different insights. We'll see if we get to them all. And we'll go chronologically through the Torah portion. So here we're told that Yaakov lives in the land of Egypt for 17 years. So it's pointed out that this number 17 we've heard before in relationship to Yaakov, and that was in Parshat Vayechi, where it says that these are the generations of Yaakov, Yosef. And Yosef was 17 years old. When he was sold by his brothers, he was 17 years old. So there's obviously a connection here that those 17 years were very good years for Yaakov. If you remember, it says, V'yeshev Yaakov be'eretz megurei aviv be'eretz Canaan. Yaakov wanted to sit in peace in the land of Canaan. And we learn that he wanted to sit in peace, but then the whole problems and troubles of Yosef jumped on him. But those 17 years relatively were very good years for Yaakov. And now he's reunited with Yosef again after 22 years. And so it says he lived another 17 years as, in a sense, a midah keneged midah. It was almost like a reward for those really torturous 22 years when he thought that Yosef was dead. So it's interesting, if you look at the first word of the parsha, Vayechi. Vayechi has a gematria of 34. 34, of course, is 2 times 17. So here are 2 periods in Yaakov's life that were good years, because 17 is gematria tov. That's why we say that his 17 years in Egypt, we'll almost say, ironically, paradoxically, were some of the best years of his life, even though he's out of Israel and the coming slavery, Yaakov understood that it was coming, but nonetheless, in those 17 years, they were good years. So what I want to comment on, that was all an introduction, and this Torah could be given over just as well in the previous parsha, because in the previous parsha, when Yaakov comes down to Egypt, so Yosef brings Yaakov to Pharaoh. And it says that Yaakov blessed Pharaoh. And then it says, Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" And he answered that his year, he answered, he was 130 at that point. And he said, the days of my life have been ma'at v'ra, little and not so good. Ra is actually evil. And everyone questions, why did Yaakov answer like this? What was he getting to? And so the secret is his age when he said it, that he was 130. And here we see in the beginning of our parsha, it says that he lived 17 years in Mitzrayim. And when he passed away in this Torah portion, he was 147. So if you take away the 7 from 147, it gives us again the 130. So the question is, why did Yaakov, actually he says why they were ma'at, they were short or small. He said, because I didn't reach the years of my fathers. Yitzchak passed away at 180 years old, and Avram passed away at 175 years old. So Yaakov already, he was only 130 then, but he prophetically felt that he was not going to reach the age of his father and grandfather, Yitzchak and Avram. But let's just discuss this 130. So this is a teaching from the Arizal. It's a well-known teaching. Excuse me. Let me drink something. So it says in the Torah, in Parshat Vayechi, that Avram separated from Chava for 130 years. After the birth of Cain and Abel, and then what happened to Cain killing Abel, that Avram separated from Chava, meaning sexually, for 130 years. They weren't like divorced or separated, but they did not have relations. And the Ari reveals that during those 130 years, Adam was spilling seed. And according to the Ari, this act of Adam created souls in great need of rectification. Not physical souls, but spiritual souls that would be incarnated into human beings. It's a very, very deep and profound teaching from the Arizal. And so after 130 years, Adam and Chava get back together and they give birth to Seth. And so this number 130 becomes very, very important, that the Ari says, so what happened to all of these unrectified spiritual souls? Now we have to understand that Adam and Chava, their first incarnations were Avram and Sarah. And we're told that when Avram and Sarah were together intimately for all those years, and they didn't have physical children, so we're told that they actually gave birth spiritually to all future converts. So it's a very similar concept. But here, Avram and Sarah had marital relations with this, and that was a great tikkun, where here Adam separated from Chava, and he was spilling seed. And so the Ari gives over that the souls that were created by the act of Adam, they went through 4 incarnations. The first was the generation of Noah, which ended up not good, a flood. Then they were incarnated into the generation of the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babel. And again, the souls were not rectified, but it's in that generation that Avram is born. And so little by little, first of all, you had Noah. The world is saved through Noah. And then you had Abraham, came from the second generation. The third generation were the evil people of Sodom. And yet Avram saves Lot, his nephew, from Sodom, and from Lot, and even though it was an incestuous relationship with his daughters, from that, we'll call it strangely, paradoxically, mysteriously, comes the soul of Ruth, and from Ruth comes the soul of David, and from David comes the soul of Mashiach. And so in each of those generations, the whole generation was penalized through the flood, the dispersion at the time of the Tower of Babel. The people of Shechem were all killed in a fire and brimstone from heaven. But little by little, there were sparks that were being redeemed. And then the Ari says the 4th generation are the Jewish people in Egypt. Now here, because of Avram began to fix the sin of Adam, and then Yitzchak and Yaakov, and he gave birth to the 12 tribes. So little by little, the souls were fixed. The souls that weren't fixed were the mixed multitude. They were on their way to being fixed, and God told Moshe, don't take them. Don't take them out of Egypt with you. They're not ready. So all of this brings us to understanding why Yaakov says the days, I'm 130 years old, and my days were short and evil. Now there's a saying in the Gemara that the face of Yaakov was like the face of Adam. That, in fact, when the angels who were going up and down the ladder in Yaakov's dream, and they saw the face of Yaakov, it was just shining. The Gemara says that the face of Adam was like shining like the sun, greater than the sun. Meaning spiritually, he was just emanating light. And the Talmud tells us that the face of Yaakov is like the face of Adam. But what this is telling us deeper is just like Avram is an incarnation of Adam, and Sarah is an incarnation of Eve. And they begin this long, long process that we're still involved with of fixing the sin of eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Well, Yaakov, so he was aware of the fixing. And that's why we look at Yaakov's life, and it was full of challenge. From the moment that he's born, holding on to the heel of Esav, his whole life was full of challenge with Esav, with Lavan, with Shechem, just one incident after another. And then with Yosef, what happened with Yosef? And so here he's finally back with Yosef. So it says he lived 17 years. But this number 130, and there are other places where this number 130 appears. And it's a very, very significant number. But here I'm just trying to limit it to the opening verse of this parsha to understand, again, when you take the 17 years that Yaakov lived in Egypt, and he passed away at 147, so that's the same 130 years that he spoke to Pharaoh. And so there he called them evil. And yet these 17 days, remember 17 is Gematria Tov. So Yaakov is involved his entire life with either consciously or unconsciously fixing the Eitz Hadat Tov Ra. And in every generation, we fix it a little bit, or at least hopefully. So that is just an insight into the opening verse of this Torah portion. Then, right after that, Yaakov calls to Yosef and says, I want you to promise me, to make an oath that when I die, that you will bury me in Israel. For those who are following the Living with the Times, so one of them this week is going to talk about this whole idea of Yaakov dying outside of Israel and his desire to be buried in Israel. So here in the Hebrew, it says, V'asita imadi chesed v'emet. This is in the 29th verse. The 29th verse of the 47th chapter. It says, and Yaakov says to Yosef, and do for me chesed and emet. Do for me a loving kindness and truth. So Rashi brings a commentary that has really become part of Jewish tradition. And that is, to our day, it's said that when a person passes away and someone is involved in the burial, makes the arrangements, goes to the funeral, comforts the mourners, helps pay for it, whatever it is, it's called, from these words, chesed. It's actually called chesed shel emet, a true chesed. And Rashi explains that why is this called a true chesed? There are many things that we relate to as being acts of loving kindness. Why is this called like the most truthful type of chesed? And the reason is, Rashi says, is because the person who's doing this act of helping to bury a person, and we know from the way Avram buries Sarah, the way here in this parsha, where all the sons accompany Yaakov's body back to Israel for burial. And at the end of this parsha, Yosef also makes the brothers promise that when they come out of Egypt, that they will bring his bones. Yosef dies in Egypt and is buried there. But he said, when you come back to Israel, make sure to take my bones with you. And that's what Israel did, especially Moshe. Moshe was the one who located the bones of Yosef. and brought them out. And they were buried in Shechem to this day. This is one of the places that we know for sure is the burial place of a holy person. So just to go back to the Rashi, so Rashi says, because the person who passes away can't pay back the favor or the money or the time or the effort that a person does in involving themselves with the burial. So that's why it's called chesed ve'emet. It's a true chesed, because so many times we do chesed for others. We want to do chesed. We have compassion. We have empathy. But many times it's unconscious. Sometimes it's conscious that we want the person to be aware that we're doing them this favor, that we're doing them this chesed. And maybe in the future, the person will remember and do chesed for us. Or we have a certain amount of pride that we're helping someone out, whatever it is. But the Rambam, Maimonides, lists 8 different rungs of giving charity. And the one that's called the highest rung is when a person gives and they don't know who they're giving to. They're just giving, and they're not expecting a payback. They don't want the recognition. They don't want their name on the building. They don't want their whatever it is. They just want to do pure chesed, chesed shel emet. So that's a very similar thing. That's why the Rambam puts it at the highest rung of giving charity, is because there's no desire for recognition or to get any kind of a payback, other than it's a mitzvah to help other people out. So that is an important thing. We know that everything in the Torah is an example for all of Jewish history. So here, when Yaakov has Yosef promise to bring his body to burial in Israel, so it's called chesed ve'emet. Like I said, I'm going through a series of shorter insights tonight. Okay, the next one is that I'm not dealing with every part of the portion. Here, I've written about it extensively in the previous Orchard books, especially the blessing that Yaakov gives to Ephraim and Manasseh, his grandsons. So that I'm not going to deal with tonight. For those who have, I don't remember, I believe it's in Fruits of the Orchard. Though it could be in Orchard of Delights, I think it's in Fruits of the Orchard. But what we're going to skip to is Yaakov calls all of his sons and says the following. Give me 1 second. So it says like this. This is the 49th chapter. If anyone's following, the first verse in the 49th chapter. It says, Vayikra Yaakov el banav, v'yomer he'esafu bi'agida lachem et asher yikra etchem bi'achrit hayamim. This is a fairly startling statement. Yaakov says to his sons, saying, gather together, and I will tell you what will happen to you in the end of days. So this is the source for this concept called Acharit HaYamim or Ketz HaYamim. At the end of days, what is going to happen to you? So Yaakov is prophetically ready to tell them what's going to be with Jewish history. How is it? Where is it all going? How is it going to end? What is all of your part in this? And then immediately it says that he addresses his children and starts to give them blessings. And so you look at the blessings, and the natural question is, well, where is the prophecy of the end of days? It's not there. So Rashi tells us, in fact, in the first Rashi of the Parsha, he comments, and this you could look in Orchard of Delights. This is what's called a closed Parsha. Why is it a closed Parsha? It's the only Parsha in the Torah that's called a closed Parsha. What does that mean? It means that in every other instance, when you have a new Torah portion, it will not start on the same line that the previous Torah portion ended. It will always go down a line. And that means it's open. But here, the Torah portion of Vayechi begins on the same line as the end of the previous Parsha. And therefore, it's called a closed Parsha, Parsha Stuma. That's the Hebrew term for it, Parsha Stuma, closed Parsha. So Rashi gives two reasons. The first one is because in this Parsha, we're going to see that Yaakov dies and Yosef dies, which means it's the end of a chapter. It's also the end of the book of Genesis. And so because when this book ends, it means that the oppression and the slavery of Egypt is soon to follow. And so Rashi says that's why it's a closed Parsha, because the hearts of Israel were closed because of the impending slavery. Now remember, all of this goes back to the prophecy of the covenant between the pieces, where God revealed to Avram that your descendants will go down to a foreign land and they will be oppressed for 400 years. And then they will come out with great wealth. And so this prophecy was handed down, excuse me, to Yitzchak and Yaakov to his sons. They all lived under the weight of this prophecy, even though no one knew exactly how it would play itself out or where. It didn't say Egypt per se, just said in a foreign land. And so that's what Rashi says. This is called a closed Parsha because their hearts were closed because of the impending oppression. But then he gives a second opinion. He says that Yaakov wanted to reveal what would happen in the end of days, but the prophecy was closed off to him. The Shekhinah left him. The spirit of pure prophecy left him. And many people say it's actually not such a bad thing that Yaakov didn't reveal what would happen in the end of days, for two reasons. One is, especially many people interpret all of the wars of the last 100 years, that the world and specifically Israel, has gone through, including the Holocaust, all the wars of the last 75 years since the rebirth of the state of Israel, and right now, the difficult period we're in a state of war here. And many interpret that this is what the prophets meant when they said that it doesn't have to happen this way, but possibly before the Messianic era, it will be preceded by very, very traumatic times. As all prophecies, it doesn't have to happen that way. But if certain factors and people don't change their ways, then that is how it will play itself out. So some people say that it's better that it's not spelled out, that Yaakov didn't have a chance to spell it out. And secondly, even more important, is even though in principle, in potential, Mashiach could come any day. Last year, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, it could have happened at any point. But Yaakov is seeing that there is a great possibility that it would take thousands of years. And so many commentaries say it's better that he didn't tell everyone, oh, by the way, this great redemption of the world that we're all hoping for is going to take thousands of years. So it was closed off to him. Nonetheless, when you go through the blessings that Yaakov is giving his sons, and especially if you read the commentary of Rashi, there is a lot of prophetic material here. In Orchard of Delights, I wrote a whole article about the blessing that Yaakov gives to Yehuda. And it is full of prophecy. And in fact, I believe on Thursday, hopefully you will all tune into your Living with the Times. That is the subject of the Living of the Times, is the blessing that Yaakov gave to Yehuda. Tonight, I want to talk about the blessing that Yaakov gave to the tribe of Dan. This is one that also, when we read Rashi, it is totally prophetic, totally prophetic. So I'm going to read for you in Hebrew, and then I'll translate the blessing that Yaakov gives to Dan. It says like this: Dan Yadin Amo Ke'achad Shiftei Yisrael. The tribe of Dan. Now, you can translate this one of two ways. Yadin Amo could mean, and Dan will judge his people like one of the tribes of Israel. Or the word Yadin, this is how Rashi says it means to take revenge. Who is the revenge on? The Philistines. Because of all of the enemies, if we go to the book of Yoshua, Judges, both Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet, the thorn in the side of Israel through all those generations were the Philistines. There were war after war, generation after generation with the Philistines. The Philistines lived in where Gaza is right now. So like everything in the Torah, it has an eternal archetypal meaning for us in every generation, but especially in our generation, and especially right now. So that's how Rashi, instead of saying, and Dan will judge his people, he says he will take, in other words, he will fight wars with the Philistines. like one of the tribes of Israel. Who is this one of the tribes of Israel? So Rashi tells us this is like the tribe of Yehuda. Yehuda were the kings. They were the leaders. But here is a prophecy that there will come a time when someone from the tribe of Dan will become the leader, just like Yehuda is the leader of Israel. Now his blessing continues. Yehi Dan nachash alei derech shififon alei orech. Dan is like a snake that is on the highway, is like a viper on the path. Hanoshech ichvei sus v'yipol rochvo achor. He will bite like a snake. He will bite the heel of the horse, and the rider will be thrown backwards. L'yeshuatcha kaviti Hashem. This is Yaakov, like an exclamation. For your salvation, I hope, God. God, I hope. God, I hope in your salvation. Like all of these blessings, it's very, very symbolic. So let's go back now. Let's go back and try to understand this. And I have to give, I'm going to continue with Rashi. So Rashi says this is a prophecy that Yaakov was having about Samson, Shimshon. Samson is from the tribe of Dan. Right in the book, in the passages about Shimshon in the book of Judges, it says that he is, right in the beginning, he's from the tribe of Dan. And later in the book, it says that he judged Israel for 20 years. He was the leader of Israel. He was the judge. Now we have to understand this is before there was a king. This is before the time of Shaul, of Saul. And that's when the judges were the leaders. So Samson was the leader of his generation. And that goes back to the first words, Dan Yadin Amo. So Yaakov's having a prophecy that there'll be someone from the tribe of Dan who will be a judge in Israel, who will be the leader like one of the tribes, Yehuda. But even more than that, what Rashi is saying, he will take revenge on the Philistines. So I want to give credit where credit is due. I think I've mentioned this book before. This is called Samson's Struggle. I believe you can get it on Amazon. It's written by Rabbi Gershon Weiss in collaboration with Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. It is a phenomenal book. I've reread this book countless times. And the reason is when you read the story of Samson in the book of Judges, and you don't read Rashi, you don't have any oral tradition. It is one of the strangest stories in the entire Tanakh. If you go through it, it's like, I'll use the word strange because it's very difficult to understand who Shimshon was, why he acted the way he did, how, and considering that, how he was considered the leader of Israel for 20 years, and his whole life and death are full of mystery, So this book is anyone who, even if you read especially if you read it in English, And I invite everyone, read the story of Samson in the book of Judges, and you'll come out like, what's going on here? Like, why is he acting the way he's acting? So this book explains, and Rashi also explains. So in short, what we're going to say is like this. Yaakov has a prophecy about someone from the tribe of Dan. And Rashi explains to us, he sees that there's someone from Dan, and that is Shimshon, who will be a judge, but he will also take revenge against the Philistines. And the key word here is Echad Shiftei Yisrael, like one of the tribes of Israel. But Shimshon understood, because the Philistines were very strong, and in many instances they were victorious over Israel, and they were a terrible thorn in our side for generations. And Shimshon understood, and this is the key element here, is if you read the beginning of the story, so an angel comes to the mother of Shimshon and reveals to her, you're going to have a very, very special son, and he is going to begin to reverse the whole history of warfare with the Philistines. And the angel commanded her that she had to begin to be a Nazir, to not have any grape products, and that Shimshon was a Nazir from birth. This is a very, very rare case. Being a Nazir is usually a vow that someone takes some time in their life for a limited amount of time, not to, especially to drink wine, but to have any grape product at all, and not to cut their hair, and not to become impure through being in contact with death. And so Shimshon was a Nazir from birth. And of course, this is the whole secret of his strength, was supposedly in his, not supposedly, it was in his hair. If you remember at the end of the story with Delilah, and she's trying to coax out of him, where does your strength come from? And at first he won't tell her, and then he's honest with her. This also is very mysterious, his whole relationship with Delilah. It's not always exactly what we think. When you read it in English, it's not exactly the way it appears to be. But nothing in the story of Shimshon is the way that it appears. So going back to this word ke'echad, Shimshon understood that he had to fight the Philistines alone, ke'echad, by himself. And therefore, that's how the story begins once he becomes a young man. So he decides he's going to marry a Philistine woman. His parents are like baffled, because they have this prophecy about who Shimshon is going to be, and he is a very holy person. And they're like, you can't do this. And then it says in the story that the parents didn't understand that this thing was from God. And so in short, Shimshon understands, and again, everyone's going to have to read the story of Shimshon. We really can't go through the whole story now. But Shimshon goes ahead and he marries this Philistine woman. And because of that, he picks a fight with the Philistines, But they don't think of it as he's representing Israel. Shimshon plotted to make he would become public enemy number one in the eyes of the Philistines. But they looked at him as an individual, and they thought of him as being crazy, because a lot of his actions seemed to be crazy. But like it says, his parents didn't know this was all from God. In other words, and this is the key what I'm saying, Shimshon read the blessing that Yaakov wrote for the tribe of Dan, and he decided to fulfill it to a T. And so he went to war against the Philistines single-handedly. And there's a number of incidences. The most famous one is where he single-handedly kills 1,000 Philistines. Single-handedly. He had what we'll call superhuman strength. And again, when it was over, the Philistines didn't go to war with Israel, because to them, it was between them and this individual called Shimshon. And after he killed 1,000 men, then it says, and Shimshon judged Israel for 20 years. And then after 20 years, mysteriously, he shows up in Gaza, and he goes to a woman of ill repute. It doesn't say what happened there, but again, it's clear that Shimshon is plotting to scare the Philistines again. And so all of the Philistines hear that Shimshon is in town. They surround the town. And Shimshon gets up very early in the morning, and he picks up the gates to the city, and he carries again, superhuman strength. He carries it for, I don't know how long, 20, 30 kilometers. In the eyes of the Philistines, they're like, well, we're not going to mess with this guy. So that's what it means here when Yaakov is prophesying and says he will be like a snake on the highway. He'll be a viper on the path. In other words, he will attack alone, like a snake, wily, in ways that are never expected. And then it says that he will bite the heel of the horse, and the rider will fall backwards. And so that's interpreted that the rider falling backwards means that the rider is not like falling forward and hurting someone else. He's falling backwards because, again, the Philistines consider this a war between the Philistines and Shimshon as an individual. And so this is an incredibly profound idea here, that Yaakov prophesizes about a future figure. And this future figure acts according to the prophecy that he understands applies to him. So it's just an incredible concept. At the end, Yaakov says, "L'yeshuatcha kaviti Hashem." For your salvation, Hashem, I have hoped. Rashi tells us that when Yaakov saw this figure prophetically of Shimshon, he thought he was worthy to be Mashiach. He was worthy to be Mashiach. And then he sees that in the end, the Philistines capture Shimshon because Delilah cut off his hair and he lost his strength. He's brought to Gaza. And then at the end of the story, his hair begins to grow back, not a lot, but enough. And they take out his eyes and they blind him. And the Mishnah in Sota says that this is a classic example. And I believe a couple weeks ago in one of the classes, we discussed this, the idea of mida keneged mida, measure for measure. And we quoted this Mishnah where it brings a couple of examples of what does a measure for a measure mean. And the first example it brings is Shimshon. And it says, because Shimshon went after his eyes, remember, he married a Philistine woman. Then he went to a woman of ill repute. Again, it never says that he was together with her, but he went to her house, and then he got involved with Delilah. So the Mishnah says, because he went after his eyes were taken out. That's the first example is brought. The second one is of Avshalom. Avshalom, who rebelled against his father David, rebelled in meaning war. He wanted to take over the kingdom, and he was ready to kill his father. And he had long hair and took great pride in his long hair and how handsome he was. And the Mishnah explains that when the forces of David were finally on the upper hand, so Avshalom is running away. He's on a horse, and his hair gets tangled in the branches of a tree, which stops him. And then the army had enough time to catch up with him, and he was killed. Those are the two examples that brought. Then, as we discussed, then the Mishnah brings good examples of a measure for measure. So when Yaakov sees prophetically what happens to Shimshon, he saw Shimshon as a messianic figure. And he cries out, God, for your salvation, I hope. In other words, if this messianic figure ends so tragically, God, we need your salvation. What's going to be here? So I learned from Rav Ginsburg that of all the figures in the entire Tanakh, the one that's actually closest to the Mashiach is Shimshon. And he even called him the Mashiach in the world of Tohu. Tohu is the previous world, the chaotic world of Tohu, where the lights are tremendous, but the vessels could not hold the light and they shattered. And Rav Ginsburg explains that this is what happened with Shimshon. His lights, his power, his purity, his holiness was so tremendous, but he was a human being. And even though all the incidences with women, the first two with the women from the Philistines, he was doing it for a good reason to save Israel. But nonetheless, the sages saw that he was human. And a little bit, he went after his eyes, which is especially true with the whole story with Delilah. So this is just such an interesting idea here. So here, as I said, I wrote in Orchard of Delights of all the prophecy that is embedded in the bracha to Yehuda. And here, all of this prophecy embedded in the blessing of Dan. So even though Yaakov could not reveal what would happen in the end of days, he hid many, many prophetic ideas. And if you go through all of the Rashis, you'll see that there's more and more in the other tribes as well. But what I found fascinating was this idea that we'll call it either the relativity of time, the elasticity of time, the how the past is connected to the future and the future to the past. This idea that Yaakov is prophesying about an event hundreds and hundreds of years in the future, and Shimshon, and that's one of the main points made in this book, is that Shimshon decides to act the way he acts based on the blessing to the tribe of Dan. In other words, he applied it to himself, and that's how he went about doing what he did. And that's just such a fascinating idea. Okay, another relatively short idea, and I've already introduced it, where Yaakov says to his sons, gather around me, and I will reveal to you what will happen in the end of days. So this is an idea from the Slonim Rebbe in the Tivot Shalom. He says like this, and the Tivot Shalom does this often, and those who have the book 70 Faces, there's a whole chapter about if you change the punctuation in certain verses, you'll get a completely different idea. We usually read it, and we have a tradition of how to read the punctuation in a verse. It has a lot to do with what's called the trop. The musical notes tell us how to read the verse, how to punctuate the verse. But we also know that there's this possibility that if you change the punctuation, you'll get a different idea altogether. And I believe there's a whole chapter in 70 Faces bringing many examples of this. So the Slonim Rebbe does it in this verse. And he reads it like this, that Yaakov calls to his sons and says, gather, and see, agida means, and I will tell you. This is actually the root of the word, the Haggadah is lahagid. But he reads it as the root, Aleph Gimel Daled, also means a special kind of oneness, a community of people with the same purpose, is called an agudah. One of the religious parties in Israel is called Agudat Yisrael, like bringing together a commonality of people with the same views. So the Slonim Rebbe says that when he says, gather together and I will tell you what will happen at the end of the days, he reads it, gather together, because in the end of the days, Israel will become one unit, one unified unit. And the way that the Slonim comes to this is one of the most important parts of the prayers on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. On Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, in the Amidah, so we pray that the whole world will become Agudah Echat. a spiritual global village. That's how we would say it today. One entity, one group, that the whole world will come together in a harmonious cooperation that will be called an aguda echat. So that's how the Slonim Rebbe reads this. He reads it gathered together, because in the end of days you will become an aguda echat. So it's a short word, but I always thought that it's just such a beautiful idea. And that's connected to the Haftorah that we just read on Shabbat for Parshat Vayigash. Parshat Vayigash, here the family of Yaakov, which really means the nation of Yaakov, for all the years that Yosef was in Egypt, was splintered, was divided. And then Yehuda comes to speak to Yosef, and then Yosef reveals himself, and the family is brought back together. And so the Haftarah, which always is connected to the theme of the Torah portion. So God comes to the prophet Ezekiel and says, take two branches, take one branch and write on it Yosef and all of Israel, Ephraim. Take another branch, Yehuda, and all of Israel, and put the two branches together, and they will become one branch. And then God continues telling Yechezkel that in the future, now remember, this is at the time that there was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And God is saying the day will come where the split in Israel will be healed, just like taking two branches and putting them together, and that you will become one people with one leader, and I will bring you back to Israel, and you will all be one people under one sovereign. So that's the same idea here. It's the same idea. And we actually say it every day in the Aleinu. Every day in the Aleinu. The Aleinu is the closing prayer of every prayer service. Every prayer service ends with the Aleinu. And in it, it takes a lot of words to say it, but basically what it's saying, God, we are praying for the time when you will reveal yourself to the whole world, and the whole world will come together and acknowledge the one God. And it ends with, and that day you will be one and your name will be one. The whole world will come together in recognition of one God. So let's end with a bracha. This is the parsha of brachas. Yaakov's giving brachas. So may we see this time that was prophesied. May we see this time that all of Israel comes together and the whole world comes together in an aguda echat.